Hello. What I want to talk about today is China. I've been interested in China for a long time. I grew up in an intensely Chinese environment. I was in San Francisco. I attended San Francisco public schools. I lived in an increasingly Chinese neighborhood, and I attended Lowell High, which had an unusually high proportion of Chinese students. They were there. It was an academic high school. They were there because they deserved to be there. Even if their parents had arrived just a few years before and there wasn't a word of English spoken in their households, these students worked hard, studied hard, and eventually they did so well that the leftists on the San Francisco Board of Education imposed a quota to keep them out of Lowell because it just wasn't fair, quote unquote fair, to the leftists that Chinese were taking places that ought to go to more deserving minorities. The Chinese students fought a huge battle and they won. And eventually the Board of Education just did away with Lowell altogether because they couldn't stand the inequities. That's another story. But be that as it may, I've always found Chinese culture fascinating. Overall, I'm in many ways a fan of China. I also view China as our greatest geopolitical enemy. And it's an interesting enemy because it is one that avoids ground combat, for which I'm very grateful. Although that might not be as serious an issue as some fear, it would still be a dreadfully serious issue. But the way China does warfare in this modern age is economic warfare. It got a lot of advantages when it was coming out of communism, and I don't know if it still exists. I've traced it and I can't remember anymore. But for a long time, one of the reasons Chinese products were so cheap was because it was actually cheaper to ship something from China than to ship it from a local manufacturer to, say, Walmart. And that may have been done away with. I'm not sure. But in any event, there were a huge amount of incredibly beneficial trade agreements under the belief that China, instead of becoming a mercantilist tyranny, would become a true free market, free society. That did not happen. Also, if you watch me, I like watching videos about China. I post them on American Thinkers recommended videos because it is fascinating. It is a combination of incredible high tech, which is what we see, and complete rural poverty and collapse as young people head for the cities. But within these urban areas, these rural areas, people have a lot of electricity because of the coal plants that are burning. In the cities, everything is done over the internet, over apps. It's incredibly efficient, but how strong is this economy really? And there were two articles in the last week at the Wall Street Journal that I found really interesting, and I think they're worth discussing because they show that, I'm not going to say paper tiger because China's symbol is a dragon, that China is both something of a paper dragon and also a very dangerous geopolitical enemy. Before I get to those, I have been watching for years the problems China has with its hugely overbuilt real estate market. It invested heavily in these vast real estate developments that now stand empty. It also, in some ways, has a fake economy because what looks like real growth is government subsidized growth, and eventually the government runs out of money. It's one of those things that's a downward spiral that keeps going and going and going until it stops. It's like that famous line from Hemingway about bankruptcy. How did you end up in bankruptcy? Slowly first and then quickly. It's also, the military is not as great as it seems because the one-child policy, where people had only one child, they went for sons. They were a traditional society. And these boys are pampered little princes. And if you think the younger generation in America has a harder time adapting to the military, I had a very dear friend who entered the American military in 1979. And he said that by the time he retired, training new recruits was just a completely different ballgame because they had to be coddled before they could even be gotten to the point of starting to train them. It's actually worse in China. When you see a military parade with all those incredibly gorgeous, height aligned, weight aligned, perfectly uniformed people all marching like robots in perfect synchronization, that is something of an illusion. much of China is a Potemkin village where it is created to look good, but behind the scenes it isn't so good. The military has a lot of recruits who aren't very good. It has a corruption problem at a level we don't really understand, which is selling off oil and equipment. That's why there were a bunch of purges in the military, I believe, earlier this year. So a lot of structural problems. China, we're told, has 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. Serious Chinese watchers doubt this, given for how long the one-child policy ran. It's unlikely that demographically China is over a billion people, so it may be inflating its population by as much as 30% on the high side. Lots of problems. So now let me get to the two articles I read that discuss issues that make me think that China is both less dangerous than we think and infinitely more dangerous, because there is nothing more dangerous than a powerful animal that feels itself weakening and trapped. This first essay, which I've put on the screen, is from the Wall Street Journal. It's by Joseph Sternberg, dated July 16th, and its title is pretty clear: China's economy is in worse shape than you think. So I've got a lot of stuff I want to read to you. Bear with me. Beijing's statisticians on Wednesday said the gross domestic product grew 4.3% year-on-year in inflation-adjusted terms in the April through June quarter. China's economic data are notoriously prone to fiddling for political purposes, and only this March, the Communist Party set a GDP growth target range of 4.5% to 5% for the year, its most pessimistic since the 1990s. When the target range was announced, this newspaper's editorial columns observed that it was less a realistic policy goal and more a statement of the highest rate of growth Beijing thought it could plausibly pretend to achieve. 4 months later, the party is conceding that even that low target would strain global credulity. Meanwhile, there's accumulating evidence that the country's true GDP growth rate may be zero, or that the economy is in outright recession. Retail sales were a bright spot in the last decade, increasing 1% year-on-year in June, but looking across recent months, the measure of domestic household consumption may be stuck in neutral. Measures of investment are in free fall. Fixed asset investment has declined 5.7% year-to-date, and real estate investment is down 18%. Anecdotal observations also point to a recession. The big one concerns oil. Crude imports in July hit their lowest level in roughly a decade. In theory, this could be explained by a drawdown in domestic stockpiles amid continuing disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, but refinery output also is declining. The problem appears to be demand for energy within China, which is rapidly dropping. And then a bit of ... And now I'm picking and choosing my way through the essay, so I'll just say ... whenever I skip something. Beijing has provided itself a handy excuse to launch more economic stimulus this summer to get back on track for the annual growth target ... Notably, however, it's hard to find anyone who thinks any of this would launch a durable economic recovery. One reason domestic consumption is dipping is that previous iterations of the consumption subsidy, a trade-in scheme akin to the Obama-era cash for clunkers in the U.S. that rewards replacement of old items, pulled forward in time purchases that households would have made anyway, without setting in motion a Keynesian virtuous circle of new corporate investments to meet higher demand ... None of these measures would address the two most significant causes of the Chinese slump. Domestic consumption is unlikely to revive until the real estate market has found its bottom ... That leaves exports. You may have noticed that amid all this domestic doom and gloom, China keeps exporting like gangbusters, with industrial production and export sales among the few bright points in the economic story ... You can't blame them for trying, but they're pursuing this strategy in a global political environment much less receptive to Chinese products than at any time in recent decades. Some of what you're seeing is a result of Trump's policies, the tariffs, the war against Iran, which has shut down one of China's major oil suppliers, his general reorienting the world economy toward America. So Trump has significantly weakened China, but a lot of this is just the structural defects of a command and control economy, and one that eventually kept using its own stimulus. So there was never an actual profit at a certain point. The government was just robbing Peter to pay Paul. And eventually, in the transition from Peter to Paul, money always disappears, especially in a society that, if the military is any indication, has more corruption than we realize. China treats corruption in draconian fashion. It is execution, but where there's a lure of wealth, people will still try. Also, as I've mentioned in essays I've written, the Belt and Road is collapsing. It's a lot of countries don't want to be part of it anymore. China's promises failed. It didn't provide work for people local to the country because China brought in its own workers. And as we all know from buying Chinese products, China builds things shabbily. So anything it built is cracking, decaying, breaking, falling apart. Trump also blocked its control over the Panama Canal. So it's suffering a lot. Having said that, do not underestimate China. For one thing, it has a big say in the world energy market. That's partially because, unlike the West, it is continuing to build energy. It's building coal-fired plants like gangbusters. So I mentioned that even in villages, they have enough energy. They have all these electrical vehicles. It's because of these coal-fired plants. But another thing is that China has looked at the future, and it's decided that if the world is going to shift to renewables, which are very fragile, they don't work if the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, or the water doesn't flow. This is unlike fossil fuels. You need to be able to store renewables, and that's where China comes in. This is an essay by Raphael Huang. The key to solar and wind power is battery storage, and China is dominating. The subtitle, Beijing pushes technology transformation of its grid and Chinese suppliers take 90% of U.S. market, generating geopolitical concerns. I would have put a comma in front of that but this is a Wall Street Journal's editorial style. Imagine a group of battery banks that together have enough power to keep all of Texas and California going on a peak summer day. This is what China has built in the space of just 5 years, and it is just getting started. ... As recently as 5 years ago, all the storage batteries in China had capacity of less than 4 gigawatts, little more than a rounding error in the country's huge grid. As of the first quarter of this year, the country's non-conventional energy storage capacity, mostly batteries, soared to between 155 gigawatts, and Beijing said in June that it was targeting 300 gigawatts by 2030. In other words, just because of its vast landmass and its coal-fired plants and its wind and its sun, China can not only generate huge fossil fuel energy, coal, but also huge amounts of renewable energy, and it can hang on to it. And that's not the half of it. China will now be able to be fairly self-sustaining if it's able to go forward with this, if it can keep this flow going. The big concern is something different, which is that China, which already controls our renewables because it manufactures most of our solar panels and windmills. Now, these solar panels and windmills are filthy to manufacture, and they're non-biodegradable. They fill up landfills. But now China's coming at us with its batteries too. So picking up again with the essay, and Chinese batteries dominate the U.S. energy storage market too, generating concern in Washington about how to avoid reliance on its rival. Going back to where I started, China is both a paper dragon with a very fragile economy that is constantly being underpinned by a government that endlessly robs Peter to pay Paul without creating actual wealth. But China strategically is making the U.S. dependent on it. And I know Trump's trying to change that as quickly as possible. The question is whether he can. And in addition, as a reminder, nothing more dangerous than a trapped predator. And China is a predator nation, one I admire greatly in many ways, but one I would never, ever trust. And on that note, thank you so much for listening. I don't know if it's a cheerful note. I guess it is that China is not doing well. But it's still scary. I'm most grateful when you spend time with me. Thank you. And until next time, probably tomorrow, but I can never guarantee a day-by-day flow. Also, weekends and Mondays can be a little shaky. But otherwise, I'll be back with more of my wisdom for what it's worth.